One of the things I noticed very early on is that the wording about bolts in P-1100 pre-standard is not very clear. And it says here the anchor bolts and connectors shown in the earthquake retrofit schedule are the minimum required per wall line, placed within the length of strengthening where possible and spaced as equally along each wall line as possible. Now what it's saying here, you look at the graph, it tells you, say you need 10 bolts, and then you're supposed to place them in a certain way. And what it says here is you place them within the panel, which only makes sense because all the earthquake load goes there, but then spread them out along the whole wall line. And you can't do both. You can't have, say, 10 bolts and you put them all behind the plywood, which happens to be in one location, and then distribute them along the whole wall line. So this is very unclear. So the committee needs to look at bolting and see how is the best way to place bolts and how to make sure we're not putting in too many, but make sure we have enough. Before looking at placement and size of bolts in the retrofit standard, it's important to know what's already there. There actually is already a pretty good connection. The contractors could not have built these houses if the mud sills were not secure. So I'm just going to show you some photographs that tell us why we know that. And so here we see a case where the house obviously slid, a foot or so. And if you can see right here, the mud sill is exactly where it was to begin with. So here's the mud sill, there's the concrete, there's been absolutely no movement at all. The only way that could happen is if there had already been an attachment of some type. Here's a photograph that shows us the exact same thing. Obviously the cripple wall has collapsed, but notice that the mud sill has remained exactly where it was before the earthquake. So we have the mud sill runs all the way along here, and it's still attached to the concrete. We have the exact same thing over here on this side. There's the mud sill, and it is still attached to the concrete. When putting this video together, I looked at about 60 earthquake damaged homes on Google Images, and I only found 3 that actually showed you what happened to the mud sill. And I just showed you 2, and then this is the last one. Now this house is made of stucco, so you can see the stucco here, and then this is the mud sill right here. This is the foundation, and so you can see how the two stay together. Now the reason this is important with a stucco house is stucco is much stiffer and stronger than wood siding. The 2 we just looked at were with siding. This is stucco, which means that the load that is transferred to the mud sill is much higher with the houses that are made of stucco. So the fact that that mud sill stayed there is more evidence that there is an existing connection that we should consider. In a second, you're going to see a segment of a video that I did previously on a similar topic, and I really wanted to point out that we're talking about 30 penny nails. There's a connection between the existing sill and the concrete with a 0.207 thousandths of an inch nail, 30 penny nail, and they have a lot of lateral capacity. In fact, when I did some rudimentary calculations using the NDS, it was around 230 pounds per each nail. So when you see a nail every 32 inches on a sill connected to the concrete, that's already a pretty good connection. What they don't realize is that in order to build a house, you can't just have it sitting there with gravity. You start banging on it and the thing's going to slide off. So in the work that we do, we've taken a lot of these apart. And the way they used to do it in the old days is they would take the mud sill before it was built, and you see the nails right here. What they do is they take the mud sill, they drive nails straight through it, okay? And then they would take this and they would smush it down into the wet concrete. That's the way they used to do it in the old days. And these nails would be really big. They're almost 1/4 of an inch. Regular bolts 1/2 inch. They put these about every 18 to 32 inches, so the mud sills don't slide off. And I've never seen a photograph of one that slid off. If you happen to see one yourself, I'd like for you to send it to me. What I'm trying to show here is that even though it may not look like a house is bolted, in other words, that the mud sill is attached to the foundation, if you were to take a metal detector or you were to sand the top of the sill to see if there are any nails, there are some nails there, and there's quite a few nails there. And again, the carpenters could not build the house if the mud sill was flopping around all over the place. So they really made sure it had good connection. And the other thing is, a lot of these old houses were built when there was a guild system, the early unions, and they had training, master to apprentice, where they said, this is the way you put a mud sill, and this is the way you attach it to a foundation. And there was some very interesting work done by the Structural Engineers Association called the Rockwell tests. And in these Rockwell tests, they actually traveled all over the country to see how old houses, especially brick buildings, were built, and they found that they were the same. If you went to Oklahoma or you went to the East Coast, where it was, generally carpenters built things the same way, and what they determined was that it just passed on from a master to apprentice, as the country evolved. So we see this very, very consistently, and this is the sort of thing that you can assume is there before determining how to bolt a house. So the houses we just looked at are the ones that were built when there was no building code in effect. Now the other set of houses are those that were built under building apartments that had adopted the Uniform Building Code. That was the first building code used in California, except for local ones. For example, San Jose had one that they had adopted, I think, in 1890. But then they adopted the Uniform Building Code in 1927. And other cities, piecemeal did the exact same thing. You never know for sure. But when you crawl into a house and you see a bolt and then you see another bolt 6 feet apart, you know that that city had actually already adopted the Uniform Building Code. So of all the houses in the Bay Area, you're going to either find houses that are well secured using these very large 30-penny nails, or you're going to see houses that have bolts every 6 feet. That's all you'll see. So when determining, how many bolts and where they should go, these things should be kept in mind. I discussed this with the original chair of the Standard Plan A Committee, Jim Russell, and we determined that it made no sense to put in any more bolts than were absolutely necessary, because basically the whole thing is already bolted. Mud sill is not going to go anywhere, but it is important to have enough at these shear wall locations, and that's why in these tables, the original table with Standard Plan A, it says a certain number of bolts, and that's all you need. However, later on, other people annotated the standards so that it ended up being the same as brand new construction. Put a bolt every 6 feet, 12 inches within 12 inches of the ends, and it just ended up being a really expensive enterprise when we were trying to make seismic retrofitting cheaper by having fewer bolts, recognizing the bolting that is already there, and only putting them at the shear wall locations where all the load would end up concentrating. So that's the way it was supposed to work. Standard Plan A was designed that way, and then that is a predecessor to this standard right here that has the table which specifies a certain number of bolts. The assumption there is, based on the original table with Standard Plan A, the original assumption is that there's already some very good connections between the sill and the concrete, and those should be taken advantage of. Here's a table that shows the capacities of bolts given certain variables, such as the thickness of the sill and the species of wood. So for example, in this top table, we have 1.5 inch sill, and if you have a 1/2 inch bolt, and it goes into Douglas fir, it can resist 10,037 pounds. And if it goes into open grain redwood, it's 912. Remember, the open grain redwood is the one that has a reduction of 0.74. So when we multiply that times the Douglas fir value, we end up with this number that we see right here. So the same thing when you go down into the bolts with the 2-inch sill, we have a 5/8 bolt, and it goes into Douglas fir at 1,671 pounds. Now the reason that value is there is because, as I was told about Southern California, I've never seen it myself, but that the sills are a full 2 inch thick. and the older homes are the ones that need to be retrofitted, and that, you know, these bolts can resist that much force. And then when we go into the redwood, the close grain redwood, then we end up with 1,555 pounds. Now, close grain redwood and open grain redwood are defined as follows by the Redwood Association. If it has more than 8 growth rings per inch, then it is considered close grain redwood, and if it has less than 8 growth rings per inch, then it is open grain redwood. And primarily what we see in the San Francisco Bay Area in these older homes is the close grain redwood. In a previous video on the history of seismic retrofit codes and guidelines, I mentioned that I flew down to Los Angeles after the 1994 Northridge earthquake to find out what they had discovered. And this chart right here is one of the things they gave me, and it's really important because it talks about what plate washers actually do and their impact on bolt performance. So here it shows us that at a code allowable at that time anyway, a 1/4 inch deflection occurred at about 900 pounds if you use the round cut washers. But if you use the square washers, it went up to around 2,300 pounds. So that's a huge difference. And I don't know where this data came from. I know the building department gave it to me. I still have a copy that they gave me that talks, shows this graph right here. Who did the tests? Where the data is, I have no idea. However, it would be really handy if someone from the American Wood Council, Virginia Tech, could do some tests and find out if how big of a difference these plate washers make. And I don't think that National Design Specification takes this into account. So maybe the values that I just gave you for bolt strength, maybe they're not accurate. I don't know, because in all retrofits in the West Coast, we do use plate washers on everything, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area.